Angels Care Home Health, serving Hayes and the surrounding areas, is a Medicare-certified home health agency providing quality skilled nursing and restorative therapy services to patients in their homes.
I would recommend Angel Care to anybody. They have really helped me regain my strength.
Angels Care is there to help 24 hours a day, and all services are covered 100% by Medicare for patients who are eligible. Angels Care Home Health. We serve patients.
I couldn't have survived this without Angels Care.
Eagle Community Television presents Community Connection with your host, Mike Cooper.
Hello and welcome again to Community Connection from Eagle Community Television. Thanks for watching, and thanks to our producer, Jeff Durall. We're in the Memorial Union on the campus of Fort Hays State University, second floor, and we're visiting with Dr. Chapman Rackaway, Professor of Political Science at Fort Hays State University, also Senior Policy Fellow at the Docking Institute at Fort Hays State University. And we're talking with Dr. Rackaway, and I'm going to have to say Chap off and on, if you don't mind.
No
Chap.
problem at all.
Since we've been doing this for about 15 years, I feel like we can be a little bit more condescending to the doctor, maybe. A new book is the reason that we're talking here with Dr. Rackaway. State Voting Laws in America, Historical Statutes and Their Modern Implications. And we wanted to find out more about this from Dr. Rackaway. Okay, Chap, let's start. First of all, should I instruct Jeff Durall, our producer, to disguise your image and maybe disguise your voice a little bit so you don't get into trouble with Altoona Representative Virgil Peck?
As long as House Bill 2234 hasn't passed yet, we don't need to put a paper bag over my head just yet. We'll see what happens later on in the legislative session if that bill actually passes. But for right now, we're in the clear.
Ah, that's good to know, because there's a certain connotation when you have that doctor in front of your name that perhaps you know what you're talking about, I think. As opposed to some in the Kansas legislature who would go unnamed that maybe have no clue. But let's leave it at that for now, shall we?
It's probably best for both of us.
I think so. All right, state voting laws in America. How did it come about, Chap?
Well, it's a project that I didn't work on alone. Two of my deeply respected colleagues from graduate school are the co-authors on this. Michael Smith, who's a department chair and an associate professor at Emporia State, so one of the sister institutions in the Kansas Board of Regents, and our brother who has gone off to the wilds of Illinois, at Eastern Illinois University, Kevin Anderson. The three of us have worked on a variety of different projects together. And we've been researching together since we were back in graduate school. And we tend to share some common interests. One of them is civic engagement. All three of us are very actively involved, not just in research, but in efforts on our campuses to promote civic engagement among our students. We believe, and actually I'm going to speak solely for myself here because I'm going to get kind of particular with it, but I do believe that one of the most important things in any kind of democracy is voter turnout. If people don't feel that they have enough stake in the game to take the 15, 20 minutes that it takes to walk into a polling place, cast a ballot, then it says a lot of things about the value, the minimal value that they put into their democracy. So I'm kind of obsessed with voter turnout in my teaching. You know, my students will tell you that I'm constantly bringing up these charts and data about voter turnout. And the things that I've done as part of our ADP, and in fact, even just as part of the political management program that I supervise at Fort Hays, is about training students to go out there and try to boost voter turnout as political activists, political consultants, and candidates for office. So why voter turnout is lower in the US than it is anywhere else in the developed world, save a couple of different Republican democracies, has been a real puzzle for me. We're the champion of democracy around the world. In fact, during the 2000s, under the Bush administration, the Bush doctrine was that spreading democracy was the best anti-terrorism campaign you could possibly engage in. But what does it say about us as the champions of democracy if we don't practice it well here at home? And so one of the things that we notice, particularly Michael and myself being here in Kansas, is a shift in how voter turnout was being evaluated and promoted by the state's chief elections officer. And when you particularly look at the efforts that have been championed by our Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, they seemed, at least on the surface, to be restrictive of voter turnout. Proof of citizenship, to register to vote, voter ID to go into the polls, and so on. After 50 years of trying to expand the franchise, build more people into the pool of turnout, now it seemed as though those laws may actually restrict the number of people who would register and then be eligible to vote. So what we wanted to use was the 50 states of the U.S. as kind of a natural laboratory. Some of the states have laws like we have here in Kansas. In fact, Kobach has written any number of those laws that have been passed in other states, and some states are without it. So can we tell a difference between the states with these new style laws, they've only come out in about the last 15 years, and the states that do not have it? So that was really what drove us, is do we notice turnout differences, and do we notice turnout differences among different types of person when faced with these new restrictive laws?
Well, let's stick with that voter turnout for just a moment for one more point, if you would, Chap, and that is the results of low voter turnout. What happens in a democracy when people don't show up to even consider a vote?
Well, a lot of things happen. First of all, just from the standpoint of democracy, it requires citizen participation. If you read the Federalist Papers that were kind of the marketing plan for the U.S. Constitution, they reinforce this idea that the public leads. Government is reactive. The public's got to participate. They've got to make their opinions known. They've got to be out there engaged in politics. And if they're not, it means that a democracy is unhealthy. It lacks what we call legitimacy. If the public doesn't care enough to go out and turn out, or if the public is barred from going out because of various restrictions, then it sends a message that democracy is undervalued. But another element about low voter turnout is that it increases the lack of representation that we have. And it means that there's a certain type of person that tends to vote most. And I'll give you an example of that is primary elections. One of the things that I'm always railing against are primary elections, because they're unique in the U.S., and I think that they do a lot more damage generally than they do help. Look at a caucus, look at a primary. During those elections, you get somewhere between 4 and 15% voter turnout. And the people who do turn out tend to be the folks on the furthest extremes. They tend to be the most liberal and the most conservative. And so what happens, the candidates that they elect reflect that. So you've got candidates way out here on the extremes, and then they go into a general election where all of the moderate voters, the self-identifiers, the folks that didn't have skin in the game during that primary, they come in. And is it any wonder that the choices that they're faced with seem so unpalatable to them? It's because they're so extreme, they're so outside the realm of what they consider to be a good candidate. And so that has a spiraling effect. When you're presented with those extreme candidates, it lessens your interest in the general election campaign and probably has a knock-on effect that lowers voter turnout a little bit as well.
Well, and if we're observing, we see that the predecessor to Kobach was really trying to expand voter participation, if you will, more polling places, longer voting times, mail-in, drive-by voting, those kind of things that were in a way trying to expand the opportunities for people to cast votes.
That's exactly right. By requiring registration, which again is kind of a uniquely American thing, most other countries, when you turn 18, you get some kind of ID, whether it be a driver's license or your national ID, you're automatically registered to vote. And so you eliminate that prerequisite before you can go into the ballot box. We don't have that. You have to register ahead of time. And one of the things that we definitely know from an existing body of research is that the biggest impediment for people to vote is not a lack of interest, it's lacking registration. They forget to register, they miss a deadline, And so now it's election day, but they aren't registered, so they can't. They're legally barred from turning out. If you look at the turnout of registered voters, it's consistent with rates in the rest of the world, north of 70% for the most part. Yeah, our registered voter turnout's really good. It's the fact that we tend to prevent a lot of people systematically from turning out. And so there had been any number of different things, mail-in ballots, same-day registration. They were mostly pioneered on the West Coast. Oregon has been a real leader in that with mail-in balloting and day of registration. And they did see considerable spikes in turnout from those kinds of efforts. Secretary Thornburgh, when he was in the office, did some of those things here in Kansas as well. But Secretary Kobach believes that we have too much access to the ballot, that it's too easy for people to register, that illegal and undocumented immigrants are registering to vote and engaging in voter fraud. And so he saw it incumbent upon himself to try to reverse that trend and actually restrict the franchise a little bit with particularly those two things. We really focused on the need for citizenship, proof of citizenship to register, and photo ID.
And of course, the economics plays a part too, that if you can't take off time for work on a Tuesday to vote, then perhaps that impedes your possibility of being able to go to the poll.
That's exactly right. And so we were talking about how some elections can get unrepresentative of the general population. That's a perfect example of it, is if you are on an hourly wage, you have to take time off of your work, and that's unpaid work. So are you going to work an extra hour and make more money, or are you going to take that time, you're going to go to the polling place? A lot of people say, I'm going to continue to work. And so that further disenfranchises people. Then you think about the fact that especially in urban areas, people don't have cars, they have no need for a driver's license, so they might not have the photo ID handy. And in college towns like Hayes, I'm particularly interested in it because I've been embedded in a college environment for so long, either a big state flagship university where I got my PhD or here at FHSU, because I believe in the philosophy of hooking them while they're young. If we can get young people active and engaged in politics now, it's a habit that they will continue throughout their life. And so this is the time to get people involved. And college students tend to not have their birth certificates with them. So that has created, I think, an even more significant problem in suppressing voter registrations among our college students because their birth certificate is back at home and not here.
But in our final couple of minutes here in this particular first segment, Chap, you did a little research on Kobach, found some interesting situations about how this came about from his point of thinking. Tell us about that.
Kobach's a fascinating guy, and you can't look at these laws without looking at Kobach, because not only is he doing this here in Kansas, but he's consulted with any number of states on legislation very similar to what we have here in Kansas. Arizona, Alabama, Indiana, the list goes on. I believe we're at about 17 states with whom he has consulted on developing legislation to restrict the franchise in the way that we discuss here in the book. Kobach believes pretty strongly that we have a rampant voter fraud problem in this country. And apparently it's an unreported voter fraud problem because he's made the claim that undocumented aliens are voting, and they're voting in huge numbers, and that's why we need these proof of citizenship laws. A number of people have come out very publicly saying quite the contrary, that there's no evidence. He got into a big dust-up with Kansas's U.S. District Attorney Barry Grissom because Kobach asked for prosecutorial power over voter fraud, claiming that he couldn't rely on the district attorney's office to prosecute these things. Grissom said, "You've never sent us a case, not a single case." Kobach claimed that that was then because Ron Thornburgh, his predecessor at the Secretary of State's office, had sent him a number of cases that they did not prosecute. Grissom said, "That's right. We investigated both and there wasn't enough evidence to even move to the prosecutorial phase. So there's a real difference between what we're seeing and the picture that Kobach is presenting of rampant voter fraud.
Dr. Chapman Rackaway, professor of political science at Fort Hays State University. The book is State Voting Laws in America. More as we continue on Community Connection.
Angels Care Home Health, serving Hays and the surrounding areas, is a Medicare-certified home health agency providing quality skilled nursing and restorative therapy services to patients in their homes.
There's not any words to describe their kindness.
Angels Care is there to help 24 hours a day, and all services are covered 100% by Medicare for patients who are eligible. Angels Care Home Health. We serve patients.
They saved my life.
Welcome back to our Community Connection. Dr. Chapman Rackaway, who is also at the Docking Institute and a Senior Policy Fellow at the Docking Institute, with the book, State Voting Laws in America, Historical Statutes and Their Modern Implications. And for this book, Chap, you and your colleagues, Michael Smith and Kevin Anderson, went back to the early days of this country and its founding, didn't you, to start the process?
Absolutely. We thought it was important to trace back the right to vote because there's a lot of mythology around it. And in fact, when you look at voter fraud, it's something that was kind of built into the early days of the country automatically. Early campaigns were conducted by political parties on hayracks. People would get on, they'd be able to ride, eat and drink as much as they wanted, as long as every time they stopped at a new polling place, they got out and they voted for that political party. So they really did kind of put the party in political party, but it also got the vote early and vote often philosophy started, for better or for worse. And there's always been attempts to rig the system. Some, we might look at as kind of funny and a bit more benign, but then there's others like the 3/5 compromise about slavery, or the drastic and terrible denials of civil rights and voting rights to African Americans in the post-Civil War South for the next century that were just absolutely systematic and awful. And so if we think about the overall history of this country, there has been more a philosophy of restricting the franchise than there has been expanding it. The expansion era really starts with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and kind of wraps up with the Oregon and West Coast efforts for shorter registration to voting lead-in times and mail-in ballots. Once we get to there, then the Kobach-driven restriction era begins in the early 2000s. And so, we're talking about maybe a quarter of our country's history that really focused on trying to build out more of the franchise, maybe a little bit more than that, if you can take it back to the 19th Amendment. So the early 20th century, most of the 20th century had sporadic efforts, at least, to get more people turning out to build the franchise. But for the most part, we've taken it as an opportunity to restrict, to make sure that the votes are cast are the votes we want cast, whoever we being in power are.
And it seems like a reversal, as you say, to the times of property, privilege, and race, if you will, even gender. To an extent, because, women have not had the vote all that long in our history.
That's right, and you can't talk about it without talking about property, because our political culture, thankfully, is a lot more enlightened than it used to be, and African Americans as slaves and women were considered property. Therefore, they were represented by white men who owned land, and we got away from that, thankfully, but it took gradual chipping away, and it took concerted effort. Congress, the Supreme Court, the states were kind of dragged unwillingly into that process, and the states fought hard against that through the Jim Crow era all the way through up until the 1970s. The states really fought tooth and nail, particularly in the South, to avoid all of these efforts to make sure that women, African Americans, even 18 to 20-year-olds had the right to vote, because obviously until 1971, we only allowed 21-year-old citizens and older to vote.
And then that brings in the United States Supreme Court, because it took the Supreme Court to say, no, this is restrictive, that as a country, we have to be on the same page on this.
That's right. Although it's funny that you mention on the same page, because we can't even agree what page we're on here in Kansas right now. Secretary Kobach's plans and the restrictive laws, the proof of citizenship and photo ID, have been ruled by the U.S. Supreme Court to be unlawful. And so what he has done is he said, well, the Supreme Court only applies to the federal government level. So now we have two-speed voting here in Kansas, where you can file motor voter documents that don't require proof of citizenship, but all you get to vote for are the House, the Senate, and the president. You don't get to vote at state level elections. We'll see what the courts have to say about that, because that really seems to present an unnecessary complication, and one that I think probably is fairly violative of the Voting Rights Act. But again, I'm no Supreme Court justice, so I'm kind of speculating there. But that's where we are now, is that fight has been taken to the U.S. Supreme Court about whether or not they are restrictive. For the most part, what we're seeing is that the court says that those are too restrictive, a set of laws.
Dr. Rackaway, what do you make of the push to move elections for spring elections to a November general election situation? What's behind that?
Well, there's two things behind it, and those two things kind of compete with each other. In fact, I'm part of this column consortium called Insight Kansas that includes, I'm the B team, but we've got some of the A team folks like Michael Burdett Loomis at KU, and Burdett and I particularly disagree on this because we're coming at it from two different angles. I come at it from the turnout angle. When you make elections line up in November, when you move school board, city commission elections into November, you're going to boost turnout. And I'm a big believer in turnout. Burdett believes that turnout is a bit overrated, and that what you're going to do is, by making those local elections more partisan, you're actually going to put the poison that he believes has taken over the state legislature, and that's going to leach down into the local communities. I don't dispute that. For me, the voter turnout value is so much more that I end up supporting that, because I want to see more people turning out. It's disappointing when I see how important our local elections are. The decisions that are made at the Hays City Commission, made at the USD 489 School Board, and yet 15% of people are going to turn out. I have trouble reconciling that with my vision of what a democracy should be. And so if we get that up there, where it's at least to where midterm elections are, in the mid 30% range, which isn't great. Or if we get them closer to those presidential levels, and they're 50%, which again, still isn't great, but it's better than 10%, it's better than 20%, and that's where we are now. So there are equally good reasons, as Professor Loomis has, against moving those elections, because they would be packaged with making them partisan.
Talk for a couple of minutes, if you would, Chap, about how we got to this point. Because as you mentioned earlier in our previous segment, most countries, most industrialized countries, if you will, have huge voter turnouts. We saw in Iran and some of the 80, 90% turnout.
Indeed.
Why have we not been able to get to that point? Or what's restricting?
And let me gild the lily on that, because in some of those countries, people risk their lives, Mike, to vote. They risk their lives. We can't get people to get off of the couch during an episode of Cops to go in and cast a ballot, and there are people in other countries risking their lives to do that. So just to give you a sense of proportion there, what happened was, I'm constantly saying this phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that's what happened with us. Our party system got out of control in the 1800s. Political machines ruled the urban environments, and we had a really bad situation. The parties were out of control. They were corrupt, and the public was being shut out of the political process unless you were a member of one particular party's faithful in a community. And so what we did is a classic American political maneuver. We overreacted. we bombarded the political parties with a package called the Progressive Reforms. We put in the merit bureaucracy, which was a good idea. We put the election of the U.S. Senate in the hands of the people rather than the state legislators. And we threw in these nonpartisan local elections. But the biggest thing that we did was threw in primaries. No one had ever conducted a primary election before. Take us back to some of the stuff we were talking about in the previous section. And these primaries are unrepresentative. They produce candidates that are more extreme and probably of poorer quality, certainly not well aligned to a general election. And we also included the registration requirement. So we had to do something to the political parties. We stripped them of so much power that we put power in the public's hands that they weren't ready or willing or able to take on. And so a lot of the ills that we see today are because we so stripped the political parties of their ability to link us to politics, to be that guide. Doesn't matter if it was the hayracks of the 1700s or the political machines that came through in the 1800s. We need political parties. And the other thing that those other countries have is much stronger political parties.
And that opened the door to huge money interests to be able to come in and usurp those political parties.
There's always been money in politics, but by restricting the parties, one-stop shop for political money. When the parties were powerful, they did the fundraising, they managed the campaigns, they did the advertising. So all the money went into the party and they got to allocate it as they saw strategically fit. Now, candidates themselves have to do it, and they have to get it from so many other sources because we narrowed the scope of what political parties could do and how much they could influence the elections. So we have this bad image of parties, but they're actually much better suited than interest groups or media or super PACs, any of these other outside entities to connect us to politics and to run elections in a way that's engaging to us and gets us active.
Got a couple of minutes left. You took a sabbatical last fall. Now you're working on a new book, huh? Back in the classroom.
That's right. In fact, I'm finishing up the book now, and it is related to what we've been talking about because I call the book Operator Error, Civic Failure and Its Threat to American Democracy.
When's it due?
Well, it's going to be due in May, and so I'm hoping that we'll have it published in the course of 2015. And if you listen to most people's complaints about politics, they blame the parties, they blame the politicians, they blame the system. What they're not doing is they're not putting the mirror on themselves and they're not looking at themselves, their voter turnout, their level of information, their participation in politics. So what I'm trying to do is flip the script a little bit, and I'm trying to get voters to see that our lack of participation, our minimal engagement, why I'm so interested in voter turnout, is actually the real root cause of all of these problems, and that when we start tinkering with the party's rules, with the interest groups, with campaign finance, with term limits, we're dealing with symptoms, not with the cause. And that's why people don't see substantive reform providing the kind of change that they want, because we've misaligned our treatment with the actual problem.
Conclusion and policy recommendations from the book. There's little, if any, research substantiating claims of voter fraud. Given the evidence the laws in fact suppress turnout, we urge their repeal. The conclusions from State Voting Laws in America. We're coming back on the new book that's coming out too, just as a warning, Chap.
I'll look forward to it, I always do.
Dr. Chapman Rackaway, Professor of Political Science at Fort Hays State University and Senior Policy Fellow at the Docking Institute. The book, State Voting Laws in America and Our Community Connection. Thanks for watching.
Angels Care Home Health, serving Hays and the surrounding areas, is a Medicare-certified home health agency providing quality skilled nursing and restorative therapy services to patients in their homes.
There's not any words to describe their kindness.
Angels Care is there to help 24 hours a day, and all services are covered 100% by Medicare for patients who are eligible. Angels Care Home Health. We serve patients.
They saved my life.